Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. One of the most common questions we get is about the cost of living
Right.
and how to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
And this time, we're tackling a location that's known for its beauty, its charm, and its prices. We're talking about the Emerald Isle itself, Ireland.
Of course.
Specifically, we're diving into how the cost of living there stacks up against the rest of the EU.
Okay.
Don't worry, we're not just going to throw a bunch of numbers and statistics at you.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to break it all down using the research you provided, articles, data, the works. So get comfy as we unpack this together.
It's a fascinating topic and one that's near impossible to sum up in a simple sentence.
Right.
Because while Ireland definitely has that reputation for being expensive, especially Dublin, there's also the allure of those higher salaries and that famous Irish quality of life. So it's about understanding the nuances, the trade-offs, and whether it lives up to the hype.
Yeah, exactly. And from the looks of it, you've been doing some serious digging. You've got a great mix of sources here. And what's really interesting is that they don't shy away from those high costs.
Right.
But they also highlight the benefits that often come with them. Higher salaries in certain sectors, a unique quality of life. It's all part of the equation.
Absolutely.
All right, so no time to waste. Let's jump right in. And I have to say, that cost of living index chart you found is a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
Ireland is right up there with the usual suspects, Denmark, Luxembourg, when it comes to overall price levels. It's like the expensive club, and Ireland's got its VIP membership card.
It's true. Ireland consistently ranks among the top, I'd say, 5 priciest EU countries.
Yeah.
And the data from Eurostat paints a pretty clear picture. The overall price level in Ireland is about 40% higher than the EU average.
Wow.
But as you said, it's about understanding the WHY behind the numbers.
Right.
Why is Ireland seemingly stuck in this expensive club?
Hit me with those insights. I'm ready to get to the bottom of this.
Well, a few key factors come into play here.
Okay.
Firstly, Ireland's economy is booming, particularly in sectors like tech and pharmaceuticals.
Right.
That strong economic growth drives up demand for goods and services.
Sure.
And naturally, prices follow suit.
Of course.
It's a classic case of supply and demand at work.
Okay, that makes sense. A booming economy is great, but it can definitely come with a price tag attached.
Right. And then there's the elephant in the room, the housing situation.
Okay.
Ireland, particularly Dublin, is grappling with a significant housing shortage.
Wow.
This limited supply, coupled with that high demand, leads to, you guessed it, sky-high rental prices.
Yeah.
We'll dive deeper into the housing situation in a bit, but it's a major factor in those higher living costs.
Okay, so island living, beautiful, but it definitely sounds like it comes with a literal price tag.
It does.
And to add to that, I noticed some of your research mentioned a tale of two countries situation within Ireland itself.
Yes.
Dublin seems to be on a whole other level compared to more rural areas when it comes to costs.
You're absolutely right. There's a noticeable cost of living difference between Dublin and other parts of Ireland.
Okay.
Dublin, being the economic hub, tends to have higher costs for just about everything. Housing, groceries, transportation, you name it.
So it's crucial for anyone considering a move to Ireland to factor in not just the overall national costs, but also the regional variation.
Oh, absolutely.
That tale of two countries concept is definitely something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Location, location, location. It always plays a role.
Now let's talk about the housing situation in more detail, because from what I gathered in your research, it seems like housing costs are the real kicker in Ireland, wouldn't you say?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Housing is undoubtedly the single most significant factor driving up the cost of living in Ireland.
Right.
And when we look at Dublin specifically, it's even more pronounced. Just to give you an idea, your research mentioned that renting a one-bedroom apartment in Dublin city center could set you back somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000 euro per month.
Wow. 2,000 for a one-bedroom. That's more than I pay for my entire mortgage. No wonder people are feeling the pinch.
It's a staggering amount.
Right.
And it really highlights the severity of the housing crisis in Dublin.
Yeah.
But here's something that really blew my mind. One of the articles you shared mentioned that Dublin's rent prices actually surpass those of cities like Paris and Berlin.
What?
I mean, those are global capitals known for their high cost of living.
Right.
How does Dublin even compare?
It is surprising, isn't it?
It is.
But it goes back to those factors we discussed earlier. The strong economic growth, the housing shortage, and the concentration of those factors in Dublin.
Yes.
It's created an incredibly competitive rental market. where prices have been pushed to their limits.
It's like a perfect storm of economic forces colliding head-on with a limited housing supply.
Right.
And it's the renters who are caught in the crossfire.
Unfortunately, that's the reality of the situation.
It is.
But, even with these high housing costs, there are some interesting nuances that your research uncovered, things that go beyond the usual Ireland is expensive narrative.
Right.
All right, I'm intrigued. This is where it gets really interesting, those unexpected details that make you see things in a new light.
Okay, how about this free water?
Okay.
As in truly free water for most households.
Wow.
It's a rarity in the EU, something that even surprised me.
Like, seriously, no water bills? That's unheard of. I mean, I'm used to paying for water like it's a luxury.
I know, right? And your research even pointed out that Ireland is one of the few countries with this type of setup.
Wow.
Of course, there are charges for excessive use,
Right.
but for the average household, it's a significant perk that you won't find in many other EU nations.
That's a huge deal. I mean, that's potentially hundreds of euros saved each year, which could really offset those high rental costs, at least a little bit.
Exactly. It just goes to show that even with higher overall costs, there can be these unexpected advantages that soften the blow.
Okay, so free water, that's a definite win in my book.
Right.
What other surprises did you uncover?
Well, while we're on the topic of utilities, another interesting point is that Ireland actually has a very competitive telecoms market.
Okay.
You can find some pretty good deals on internet and mobile phone plans compared to other European countries.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Given Ireland's status as a tech hub, they're probably ahead of the curve when it comes to internet infrastructure and competition in that sector.
Precisely. And for someone like you who values access to information and technology, having affordable, high-speed internet is a major plus.
For sure.
It's something to keep in mind if you're ever considering, spending an extended amount of time there.
You know me too well. All right, so we've got free water, good internet. Any other noteworthy points that stood out to you as being, unique to Ireland?
Well, this one's more on the be aware side.
Okay.
But the research consistently highlighted that Ireland has some of the highest alcohol prices in the EU.
Okay, so maybe skip the nightly Guinness habit if you're on a budget.
Well, it's not just about individual choices. It's actually a deliberate policy choice by the Irish government to curb alcohol consumption for health reasons.
Interesting.
So they're using taxation as a way to influence social behavior, which is an interesting approach.
It's fascinating how different countries tackle these kinds of issues. It really highlights the cultural and political context that shapes these economic realities.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered some, unexpected perks and some potential budgetary challenges.
Right.
But let's address the elephant in the room.
Okay.
Even with these nuances, is living in Ireland actually worth it if the costs are so high? How do those higher salaries that everyone talks about factor into the equation?
That's the million-euro question, isn't it? And the short answer is, it depends. Ireland does tend to have higher average salaries compared to many other EU countries.
Okay.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There's always a catch. Lay it on me.
Well, your research mentioned that the average annual salary in Ireland is around $49,000.
Okay.
Sounds pretty good,
That
right?
definitely has a nice ring to it.
But here's the catch. That's just the average.
Okay.
The median salary, which gives us a better representation of what the typical worker earns, is closer to $36,000.
Right.
So while those high salaries exist, they don't tell the whole story.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
The devil is in the details, and those average salaries can be a bit misleading.
Exactly. And this is where a concept called Purchasing Power Parity, or PPP, comes into play.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of it?
It rings a bell, but I could definitely use a refresher. It has something to do with how far your money actually goes in different countries, right?
You got it. Think of PPP as a way to compare how much your money is actually worth in different countries.
Okay.
It takes into account those varying costs of goods and services.
Right.
So while you might earn a higher salary in Ireland, the higher cost of living, especially for things like housing, can eat into that purchasing power advantage.
Right, so even though you might be making more money on paper, you might not actually be better off in terms of what you can afford.
Right.
It's all relative.
Precisely. And while Ireland scores relatively well on PPP overall, those high costs, particularly for housing, do take a bite out of your purchasing power.
Yeah.
It's something to consider carefully when comparing salaries and costs across different countries.
So let's make this a bit more concrete. Let's say you're offered a job in Dublin with a $50,000 salary.
Okay.
Sounds pretty tempting, right?
Does.
But because of those higher costs in Ireland, especially for housing, your purchasing power might be closer to someone making like 40,000 in Berlin.
Right.
It's a simplified example, but it illustrates how PPP can really shift your perspective.
Absolutely. It's not just about how much you earn, it's about how much that money actually gets you in your daily life.
Right, and that's why it's so crucial to look beyond those headline numbers and dig deeper into the specifics.
Exactly.
All right, so we've established that Ireland's cost landscape is complex and nuanced.
Yes.
There's no easy answer to the question of is it worth it?
Right.
But with all these factors at play, what does this actually mean for, you, our intrepid listener?
Well, if there's one key takeaway from all of this, it's that Ireland's cost of living is highly sector dependent.
Okay.
If you're in a high demand field like tech, pharmaceuticals, or finance, those higher salaries we talked about are more likely to offset the high cost of living.
Right.
But if you're in a sector with lower average wages, those costs can really sting.
So that tale of two countries thing we talked about earlier applies to careers just as much as it does to location.
Precisely. And that's why research is absolutely essential.
Right.
Don't just look at national averages or get swept away by those impressive sounding salaries. Dig deeper into your specific sector, your potential earnings, and compare those to the real cost of living in the specific areas you'd be considering.
Right.
It's about getting granular with your research and understanding the micro-level realities within those broader trends.
Practical advice, always a good thing.
Right.
I do have to say, though, one thing that jumped out at me from your research was that the cost of living in Ireland, particularly housing, seems to be on an upward trajectory.
Yeah.
So is it just doom and gloom from here on out?
Well, it's true that projections suggest costs are likely to continue rising, at least in the short to medium term.
Okay.
But, and this is important, your research also indicated that the Irish government is acutely aware of this issue.
Oh.
They're actively working to make life more affordable, especially for those who aren't part of those high-earning sectors.
Okay, so there's hope yet.
There is.
What kind of things are they doing? Give us the highlights.
There's a big push to increase the housing supply, which is really at the core of the affordability issue. They're streamlining planning permissions, investing in social housing, and exploring various initiatives to encourage more construction.
Oh, wow.
It's a complex problem, but at least they're taking concrete steps to address it.
That's encouraging to hear. What about other areas like childcare or energy costs? Those can be major expenses for people, too.
You're right. Those are huge factors. On the childcare front, there's been a lot of talk about expanding subsidies and potentially even moving towards a more universal childcare system,
Wow.
which would be a game changer for many families struggling with those costs.
Right.
And when it comes to energy, there are various initiatives to promote renewable energy sources and provide relief from rising energy bills.
Okay.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, tackling those cost of living pressures from different angles.
It sounds like they're really trying to take a holistic view of the situation, rather than just putting Band-Aids on the problem.
Exactly. And while it's impossible to predict the future with certainty, the fact that the government is actively addressing these cost of living challenges does offer a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
It's not a case of ignore and hope for the best. They're acknowledging the struggles and trying to find solutions, which is always a good sign.
I like that. A glimmer of hope. It's certainly a more positive spin than just focusing on those rising cost projections.
And, that brings us to another crucial point, the importance of staying informed.
Right.
This deep dive has given you a solid foundation of knowledge about the cost of living in Ireland,
Right.
but it's a fluid thing, constantly evolving.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, exactly. So keep an eye on those trends, keep your ear to the ground for policy changes, and don't be afraid to reevaluate your own situation as needed.
Words to live by. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've explored the highs, the lows, and everything in between when it comes to the cost of living in Ireland compared to the rest of the EU.
We have.
We've talked about the housing crisis, the higher salaries in certain sectors, those hidden perks like free water, and the government's efforts to make life more affordable.
Right.
But we wouldn't be the deep dive if we didn't leave you with a little something extra way to ponder something to spark that curiosity even further.
Okay.
I'm all ears.
Well, we've talked a lot about the economic factors, the policies, the numbers, but what about the human element? Your research touched on the idea of quality of life, But what does that really mean in the context of Ireland?
Ooh, getting philosophical. I like it.
It's one thing to look at the cost of a pint of Guinness or a monthly rent payment.
Right.
It's another to consider the intangible factors,
Yeah.
the sense of community, the connection to nature, the richness of Irish culture. Those are harder to quantify,
Right.
but they factor into the equation too.
You're absolutely right. It's about more than just euros and cents. It's about finding that sense of belonging, that feeling of being at home in a place.
Exactly. And that's something that comes up time and time again when people talk about living in Ireland.
Yeah.
There's a certain warmth, a friendliness, a sense of community that's hard to find elsewhere.
It's interesting. It's like those intangible aspects of a place, the culture, the people, the overall vibe can really make a difference.
They absolutely can. And those are things you can't really put a price tag on. So while Ireland might have a higher cost of living in some areas, it also offers a unique quality of life that resonates with many people.
Right. It's about finding that balance, that
Yeah.
sweet spot where your finances and your soul are content.
Well said. And that brings us to another important point. We've been talking about the cost of living in Ireland compared to the rest of the EU, but even within Ireland itself, there's a spectrum of affordability.
Right. We touched on that earlier with the whole tale of two countries idea,
Mm.
Dublin being the most expensive and then costs generally decreasing the further you get from the capital.
Exactly. So if you're considering a move to Ireland, don't rule it out just because Dublin's prices seem intimidating.
Right.
Do your research, explore different areas, consider your lifestyle and career goals. Ireland has something to offer everyone, but it's about finding the right fit for you.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, the place where your personal priorities align with your financial realities.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Right.
All right, so for our listener who's been diligently diving deep with us today, what would you say is the most important thing to remember as they navigate their own cost of living journey?
Okay.
I think the key takeaway here is that knowledge is power.
Okay.
Don't just rely on those broad strokes, those sweeping generalizations about a country or city being expensive or affordable. Dig deeper, get granular with your research, and understand the nuances.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions, to connect with people who live in those places, to get their firsthand perspectives.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the cost of living is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yes.
It's about finding a place where you can thrive, both financially and personally.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe Ireland, with all its quirks and contradictions, might just be that place for you.
There you go. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that.
Thanks for joining us for another dive into the fascinating world of, well, everything.
Of course.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.